Okay, so in our previous videos, we dealt with two tables. So we figured out how to find the constant rate of change when you had tables. So all you had to do was find your change in your change in dependent variable, your change in y, and you're going to divide that by the change in independent variable, which is your change in x. So basically finding your constant is basically the change in y divided by the change in x. When we have a graph, the graph is a little different situation. In order to find the change in y and the change in x, you're going to need to find two ordered pairs. You're going to have to label one ordered pair 1 and the other ordered pair 2. And then with your ordered pair, you're going to do y2 minus y1 divided by x2 minus x1. This might not make sense, but it'll make sense once we deal with our first problem right here. So in this problem, we're going to find the constant rate of change in the graph of distance traveled on a highway over time. So we have our important parts of the graph. We need to have our labels. So we know that our y-axis is distance in miles. So this is actually really helpful when you have a graph, because it's telling you, okay, y, we know that y is dependent. And it tells you your dependent is the distance traveled. So that's why I like graphs, just because it helps me figure out what's my dependent, independent. Your dependent's always going to be going up and down. And then x, I know, is my independent. So your independent's always going to be the x-axis. So we'll also have, you see that your x-axis is time in hours. So in 0, because this is the origin, that's 0, 0. In 0 hours, 0 miles were traveled. In 1 hour, 60 miles were traveled. In 2 hours, 120 miles were traveled. And in 3 hours, 180 miles were traveled. So that's how we got those points based on the graph. What we're going to do is, in order to find the constant rate of change, you're first picking any 2 points. Pick any 2 points. Right here in this graph, you have 1, 2, 3, 4. You just have to pick 2 of them. So I'm going to make it easiest for me. It's honestly really easy if you just pick the first 2 points. So I'm going to pick, for my first point, I'm going to pick 0, 0, the origin. And for my second point, I'm going to pick 160. Can you pick any other points? Yes, it doesn't matter. I just like making things easier for me, so I like picking the first 2 just because it makes it easy. Now, what's important here is my first point is going to be 0, 0, and my second point is going to be 160. That means that since this is my first point, this is actually your x1. The reason I'm calling this x1 is because your first number is always x, and since this is my first point, I'm calling it x1. This number is always your y, so I'm going to call this y, and since it's your first point, I'm going to call it y1. So it's going to help, after you pick the 2 points, it's going to help if you label them. x1 is 0, y1 is also 0. Now, this is my second point. So since this is my second point, I know that 1 is still my x value, because the first one's always your x, but is this actually going to be x2? Why did I label this x2? It's x2 because this is my second point. And 60 is your y value, so I'm putting y. But since it's my second order pair, I'm going to call that y2. So you can see x1 is 0, y1 is 0. x2 is 1, and y2 is 60. This is important because, like I said right here, in order to find a constant rate of change in graphs, you're going to do y2 minus y1 divided by x2 minus x1. So that's why I labeled them x1, y1, x2, y2. So you're going to find change in y divided by change in x, which is y2. So you're going to label, what is your y2? Y2 is 60 minus because it's y2 minus y1. What's your y1? Y1 is 0. Divided by x2 minus x1. x2 is going to be right here, 1, minus x1 is 0. That is why I think it's important when you pick 2 points, make it easy for you and label them x1, y1, x2, y2. So you know exactly how to fill in the numbers in your formula. y2 minus y1, 60 minus 0. x2 minus x1, 1 minus 0. Last step is to solve. What's 60 minus 0? 60. What's 1 minus 0? 1. So that is your answer, 60 over 1. Remember, y goes on top, so use the labels for y. Label for y was miles, so 60 miles. And then the label for x was hours, so 60 miles every 1 hour. Now, not only do we need to figure out how to find the constant rate of change in a graph, but we also have to figure out what each individual point in the graph represents. So using the previous graph, this graph right here, explain what points 0, 0, 160, and 3, 180 represents. So we're using 0, 0, which is the origin. It's asking for 160, which is that point. It's also asking for 3, 180. This is really easy. You're just explaining. When it says to explain what they represent, it just means use your labels. Use your labels to explain the situation. So if I have point 0, 0, that means that 0 represents hours and 0 represents miles. So that means point 0, 0 means 0 miles traveled in 0 hours. So all you have to do is represent the points by using the labels. You could have also said, you could have done the flip, because since they're both 0, you could have also said 0 hours to travel 0 miles. So you could say it flipped also, and that would still be right. So let's do 160. 1 is our x value, so 1 represents hours. So that means that 160 means 1 hour to travel. 60 represents miles. 60 represents miles, so that means 1 hour to travel 60 miles. Or you can say the reversed way. The reverse way would be 60 miles traveled in 1 hour. Realize it's not important the order right here. What's important is the labels. Remember that y in this graph is represented by miles, and x, which is the first number, is represented in hours. So as long as you are linking the right label with the right number, it doesn't matter if you say x first or y first. Okay, our last one, 3, 180. So 3 is our x value. 3 is our x value, and that is represented by hours. So you can say 3 hours to travel 180 is going to be your y. Y is represented by miles. So 3 hours to travel 180 miles. Or you can flip it, which is 180 miles traveled in 3 hours. So that's what it means when it's asking you what does the points represent. You're just looking at the labels of x, the label of y, and you're using that to fill in the rest. So not only does it, in this video, we talked about how do you find a change in the graph, but also how to represent the points.